The courtroom was heavy with tension that morning, the kind of silence that usually precedes a storm. It wasn't the lawyers or the bailiff who commanded the room's attention, but the young woman seated at the defendant's table, Chloe Sterling. She looked like she had just walked off a runway in Milan, not into a small claims court in the heart of the city. Her designer handbag sat carelessly on the floor, and her manicured fingers danced across the screen of her phone, clearly more interested in her social media feed than the life-altering hearing about to take place. Judge Judy had been watching her since she sat down. The judge's eyes, seasoned by decades on the bench, were narrowed behind her glasses, tracking every impatient click of Chloe's heels, every eye roll, and every time the girl checked the time as if she had somewhere far more important to be. This wasn't a meeting with a stylist. This was a court of law. "Miss Sterling," Judge Judy's voice cut through the air like a razor, sharp and impossible to ignore. The room went dead silent. Chloe didn't jump. She didn't look startled. She simply tilted her head, offered a practiced hollow smile, and looked up with an expression that suggested she was doing the judge a favor by even being present. "Yes, Your Honor?" she asked, her tone dripping with a level of artificial sweetness that made everyone in the room cringe. "This is a courtroom, not a lounge," the judge snapped, leaning forward. "I suggest you put the phone away before I find a place for it that you won't like." Chloe sighed, a sound of pure boredom, and slipped the phone into her bag, but the smirk never left her face. That smirk, it was the mark of someone who had never been told no. It was the look of a girl whose last name Sterling was a shield, a family legacy built on real estate empires and high-profile connections that usually made problems vanish before they reached a judge's ears. The air in the room felt thick. The plaintiff, an older woman named Mrs. Gable, sat directly across from her. Mrs. Gable was clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked terrified, intimidated by the luxury and the cold confidence radiating from the defendant. It was a classic setup, the powerful against the vulnerable. But what Chloe didn't realize, and what the entire courtroom was about to witness, was that today, the shield wouldn't hold. Judge Judy wasn't interested in bank accounts or last names. She was interested in the truth. And she had already spotted the first crack in Chloe's pristine facade. The judge didn't just see a defendant, she saw a challenge. Chloe was young, reckless, and deeply entitled, operating under the dangerous assumption that the world bowed to her convenience. But the moment the case began, the dynamic shifted. Judge Judy began to flip through the paperwork, her expression unreadable. She wasn't just reading the file, she was studying the defendant, waiting for the exact moment when the armor would fail. It wouldn't take long. Mrs. Gable's hand trembled as she slid the accident report across the table. Judge Judy caught the document with a flick of her wrist, her eyes narrowing as they scanned the typed lines. The courtroom, previously filled with the hum of low-frequency chatter, went deathly still. Every soul in the room felt the shift in pressure, the familiar sensation of a trap being set. "Miss Sterling," Judge Judy began, not looking up from the page, "your statement here says you were a passive passenger. You claim you were sitting in the back, entirely oblivious until the impact. You are maintaining that your driver, Carlos, was the one operating the vehicle?" Chloe adjusted her position, the nonchalance still plastered on her face like makeup. "That's exactly what happened, Your Honor. Carlos, well, he's a bit older. Maybe his reflexes aren't what they used to be. He hit the man, not me. I was just scrolling through my emails in the back seat. I didn't even realize what was happening until the car stopped." She looked up, her expression a mix of practiced innocence and mild irritation, as if she were inconvenienced by having to explain the obvious to the court. Judge Judy tapped the document with her pen, a sharp, rhythmic sound that echoed like a ticking clock in the silence. "Interesting. Let's look at the police report from the scene, shall we?" She turned a page slowly, her gaze never leaving the paper. The responding officer noted witness testimony. A pedestrian, who was standing on the corner of 5th and Main, reported the incident clearly. The judge looked up then, her eyes locking onto Chloe's. The witness states that immediately after the impact, the driver's side door opened. A young woman, blonde, wearing a high-end designer coat, stepped out. She didn't look worried about the injured man. She was screaming into her cell phone, complaining about how her night had been ruined by the accident. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Chloe's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a hairline fracture in her composure, before she managed to smooth it over with an indignant scoff. "Witnesses get things wrong all the time, Your Honor. People see what they want to see, especially when they see a luxury car. They assume the worst about the owner." "Do they?" Judy countered, her voice dropping an octave, becoming the cold, sharp instrument of justice that had terrified defendants for decades. The witness described the driver as a young, blonde woman. Now, unless your driver, Carlos, who, according to these records, is a 6'2" man, has taken to wearing designer coats and bleaching his hair, I believe we have a significant contradiction in your story. The courtroom exploded into a flurry of whispers. The bailiff stepped forward, his eyes sternly scanning the room, but the damage was already done. The defense attorney, a man who had looked so confident 5 minutes ago, suddenly started frantically shuffling through his own stack of papers, his brow damp with sweat. Chloe's hands, which had been so relaxed just moments before, now gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. She had walked in expecting to be the victim of a ridiculous situation, but the weight of the lie was now sitting squarely on her shoulders. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat. She looked at her lawyer, desperate for a lifeline, but he was too busy trying to calculate the damage. Judge Judy leaned back, the faintest, most dangerous glint of satisfaction in her eyes. The hunt had just begun. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Judy said, her gaze shifting to the defense attorney, "if you interrupt my questioning one more time, you will be holding your client's hand in the hallway, not in this courtroom." The lawyer, a man who usually commanded respect in the city's top firms, visibly shrunk back. The silence in the room became absolute, a deafening vacuum where only the judge's breathing seemed audible. Chloe, for the first time, looked physically diminished. The designer blazer that cost more than Mrs. Gable's entire annual income suddenly seemed to hang off her frame like a shroud. "Back to the driver," the judge continued, her voice dropping into that familiar, terrifyingly calm register. "If Carlos wasn't driving, and you claim you were distracted in the back seat, how do you explain the phone records provided by your service carrier?" Chloe's eyes darted around the room, a flicker of genuine fear finally piercing through the armor of her arrogance. I don't know what you're talking about. My phone records are private." "They were private until you brought a lawsuit into my court, Miss Sterling," Judy retorted, picking up a stack of printed logs. She didn't wave them. She held them with the precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. "I'm looking at your data. Sent from your phone, at the exact timestamp of the collision, not from the back seat, as your GPS triangulation confirms. You were behind the wheel, you were texting, you were driving, and you were doing both while ignoring the basic safety of every human being on that street." The gallery erupted. It wasn't just a simple mistake anymore. It was gross negligence. It was dangerous. Mrs. Gable let out a ragged sob, covering her mouth with trembling hands. The reality of the accident, the sheer reckless vanity of it, was finally being laid bare for the world to see. "My father," Chloe started, her voice cracking, the polished veneer finally shattering. "My father will hear about this. He's a major benefactor. He has friends. He can handle this." "Your father is not in this courtroom," Judge Judy barked, slamming her hand on the bench, a sharp crack that made the entire room jump. "And if he were here, he would be absolutely ashamed of the person sitting in that chair. Do not dare bring his name into my court to threaten the integrity of these proceedings. This is not about your father's checkbook. This is about your actions, your recklessness, your total inability to take responsibility for a man who now has a permanent injury because you couldn't be bothered to look at the road." Chloe was breathing hard now, the mask of the untouchable heiress sliding off, revealing a scared, petulant child beneath. She looked around the courtroom, realizing for the first time that the murmurs from the audience weren't of awe, but of disgust. The Sterling name, which she had wielded like a weapon for her entire life, was failing her. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't a playground, it was a mirror, and she didn't like what she saw. Judge Judy didn't let the momentum slip. She shifted seamlessly from the physical evidence of the car to the digital evidence of the defendant's character. "Let's talk about the 2 hours immediately following this accident," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low hum. She picked up a stack of paper, social media printouts provided by Mrs. Gable's family. Chloe's eyes widened, and for the first time, her hands stopped fidgeting. She knew exactly what those papers were. "Mrs. Gable, you submitted these," Judy noted, tapping the photos. "Would you like to explain them?" Mrs. Gable, her voice trembling but gaining strength, stood up. "My niece found them, Your Honor." These were posted by Miss Sterling on her public profile, only 2 hours after she left the scene of the accident. "My son was being prepped for surgery, and she was. She was at a rooftop lounge. The judge held up the printout. It was a photo of Chloe, smiling, holding a glass of champagne, looking radiant and utterly unbothered. The caption below it, clearly legible, read, "Somebody almost ruined my night, Lalem." The courtroom gasped, a collective sound of disbelief that rippled through the rows. Chloe turned a shade of crimson that seemed to clash violently with her expensive silk blouse. That was obviously a joke," she stammered, her voice losing its icy detachment. "I was just posting for my friends. It had nothing to do with—" "A joke?" Judy interrupted, her glasses sliding down her nose as she peered over them at the defendant. "A young man is in the hospital with a fractured leg, his life turned upside down, and you think the incident is worthy of a lol? You are telling me that you found the humor in this situation while you were sipping champagne? Which part exactly was funny to you? The surgery? The lost wages? Or perhaps the fact that you weren't behind bars yet?" Chloe's defense attorney, sensing the ship was taking on water, finally bolted from his chair. "Your Honor, if I may, my client was under immense stress. It was a coping mechanism. She's young, she's frightened, and people process trauma differently." "Counselor," Judy cut him off with a wave of her hand that commanded silence as effectively as a gavel. "Do not insult my intelligence by calling that trauma. That is entitlement, plain and simple. If your client wants sympathy, she should try honesty first, and I have yet to hear a single honest word come out of her mouth since she sat down in my courtroom." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Chloe's lawyer sat back down, his face tight, realizing he was fighting a losing battle. The judge turned her attention back to the defendant. Chloe was no longer the picture of elegant indifference. She was exposed. The lol caption had done more damage than any witness testimony could have. It revealed a coldness, a lack of basic human empathy that Judge Judy found particularly reprehensible. The judge wasn't just ruling on a car accident anymore. She was ruling on the character of a person who thought the world was merely a backdrop for her own convenience. Judge Judy didn't give her a moment to catch her breath. She picked up a separate file, one that had been resting on the edge of the bench, almost hidden beneath the pile of medical bills. "Let's move on to the integrity of this entire narrative," Judy stated, her voice dropping into a low, menacing register that made the court reporter pause mid-stroke. "I received a notarized statement this morning, dated 2 days after the accident. It's from a man named Carlos." Chloe froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale, her foundation suddenly looking like a chalky mask. "Who?" she managed to squeak out, though the sheer panic in her eyes told a different story. "Your driver," Judy replied, staring over the rim of her glasses. "The same man you insisted was behind the wheel, the man you claimed was responsible for the accident. He resigned 2 days after the incident, and in this statement, he describes a very different version of events. He claims he was approached by your father's legal team, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and pressured to sign a confession that would put him at fault, despite the fact that he wasn't even in the car when the impact occurred." The courtroom exploded into a chaotic buzz, a ripple of outrage that was quickly quelled by a thunderous, rhythmic strike of the judge's gavel. This wasn't just a traffic case anymore. It was an obstruction of justice. It was a calculated, cold-blooded attempt to ruin an innocent man's career simply to save a guilty girl's reputation. "Miss Sterling, you didn't just cause an accident," Judy continued, her eyes burning into the defendant, unwavering. "You decided to create a victim out of your own employee. You decided to trade his livelihood for your freedom. And you thought, with enough money and the right lawyers, you could force him to lie under oath. You thought the truth was something you could purchase in a boardroom." Chloe began to sob, not the refined, dainty tears of a socialite, but the jagged, ugly gasps of someone who finally realized they were cornered. She looked to her attorney, begging for help, but he was staring at the floor, completely unable to meet her gaze. He knew, just as the judge knew, that this statement wasn't just evidence, it was the final nail in the coffin. The facade of the innocent, misunderstood girl was shattered, replaced by the ugly reality of a spoiled heir who thought the law was a suggestion rather than a command. The courtroom watched, mesmerized by the collapse. The entitlement was being stripped away, layer by layer, in real time. Judge Judy had peeled back the skin of this case, and what she found underneath was rot. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Judy said, her gaze shifting back to the defense attorney, who now looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. "Your client seems to operate under the impression that if she throws enough money, enough legal obfuscation, and enough fatherly influence at a problem, the truth will simply cease to exist. It's a common delusion among the wealthy, but I assure you, it ends the moment they step into this courtroom. Chloe Sterling was physically shaking now. The tears were real, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of losing control. She clutched her handbag, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. She had spent the last 20 minutes trying to pivot, trying to blame her PR team, her father's legal counsel, the misunderstanding of the insurance company, anything to avoid looking at the facts. Let's talk about the misunderstanding regarding the insurance payout, Judy continued, her voice low and steady, vibrating with controlled fury. She reached for a manila folder, flipping it open to reveal a series of emails. Mrs. Gable, you testified that you were contacted 3 separate times by the Sterling firm's insurance adjusters. They told you that if you didn't file a police report, if you didn't seek further medical attention, they would offer you an undisclosed settlement to make this go away. Mrs. Gable nodded, her voice barely a whisper. They told me my son's medical bills would be paid, but only if I signed a non-disclosure agreement and agreed to drop the claim against Miss Sterling. They said it was for the best, that fighting a company like Sterling would only lead to a long, drawn-out battle we couldn't win. Judge Judy turned her head, slowly, like a predator locking onto its target. Miss Sterling, did you authorize your father's legal team to silence this woman? Chloe looked down at her lap, her voice trembling. My father, he just wanted to protect me. He said it was just standard procedure to avoid bad press. He didn't mean any harm. Your father, Judy repeated, the disgust evident in every syllable, is a CEO of a major corporation, not a king. And you are a legal adult, not a child in need of protection from the consequences of your own reckless actions. When you hit that man, you didn't just break his leg, you shattered the life of a family who had no interest in your money, only in their own son's recovery. And then, you added insult to injury by trying to buy their silence. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Every single person, the bailiff, the court reporter, the gallery was locked onto the scene. Chloe Sterling, the girl who walked in with designer clothes and a smirk, was now small, exposed, and utterly hollowed out. She realized, perhaps for the first time in her sheltered life, that her father's bank account was useless here. Judge Judy had dismantled her defense piece by piece, not with complex legal maneuvers, but with simple, undeniable, cold, hard truth. Judge Judy closed the folder with a definitive snap, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the hushed courtroom. She looked at Chloe, not with anger, but with a chilling, detached pity. You had every advantage, she began, her voice steady and echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Education, connections, wealth, protection. And yet, when the moment came to show a shred of humanity, you chose to lie, to hide, and to destroy the life of a hard-working man just to save your own reputation. Chloe was now weeping openly, her shoulders shaking violently, the high-end makeup ruined by mascara-streaked tears. She looked small, not the girl who had walked in with her chin held high and a mocking grin, but a person stripped bare by the weight of her own actions. The audience was silent, the previous murmurs replaced by a somber respect for the gravity of the moment. Judy turned her focus to Mrs. Gable. And you, she said, her tone softening just a fraction, you asked for nothing but honesty. It's a rare commodity in this room. She turned back to the defendant, her expression hardening once more. Your father's money may have shielded you from the consequences of your incompetence for years, but it stops here. It stops at my bench. She began to tally the figures, her pen scratching rhythmically against the paper. Medical bills, lost wages, and significant punitive damages for the blatant obstruction of justice you attempted. I am awarding the plaintiff the maximum amount permitted in this court. And frankly, Miss Sterling, the money is the least of your concerns. She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Chloe's. One day, your father won't be able to stand in front of your mistakes. You have been protected from the real world for so long that you've forgotten how it works. You thought you could treat a human being like an obstacle to be cleared from your path. Well, you found out today that there are things you cannot buy, and there are people who will not bow to you. The judge paused, letting the weight of her words sink into the floorboards. When the cameras are off and the lawyers are gone, your character will be all you have left. And from what I've seen today, you have quite a bit of work to do. The bailiff stepped forward, his expression stoic, waiting for the final instruction. The room felt like it had been held in a vice, and as the judge finished, the pressure finally began to ease. But for Chloe, the ordeal was only just beginning. She had lost more than a lawsuit. She had lost the illusion that she was special. Judge Judy didn't offer a platitude or a sympathetic nod. She kept her focus firmly on the defendant, her expression a mask of stern, uncompromising justice. "The money," Judy declared, the ink on the court order still wet, "will be paid in full within 30 days. Do not think for a second that your father's legal team can find a loophole around this. It is a court order, and it is final." Chloe stood up, her knees visibly weak. The designer heels that had clicked so confidently at the start of the hearing now felt like lead weights. She looked at Mrs. Gable, who was standing by the plaintiff's table, gathering her belongings with a tired, measured precision. Mrs. Gable's face was etched with a lifetime of struggle, a stark contrast to the pampered, terrified youth of the girl who had changed her world in a split second. I am sorry," Chloe whispered. The words sounded foreign, clumsy on her tongue, but they were the first authentic sounds she had made all day. Mrs. Gable paused, holding her folder against her chest. She looked at Chloe, not with hatred, but with a weary, profound disappointment. "I don't need your pity, Miss Sterling," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I needed you to be a human being on the day of the accident. I needed you to see my son as a person, not an inconvenience. That is something money could never buy." Mrs. Gable turned and walked toward the exit, the heavy wooden doors swinging open to let her out. She didn't look back. Chloe was left standing in the center of the courtroom, an island of isolation in a room that had just seen her stripped of her armor. The bailiff signaled for the next case, the standard procedure moving on like a machine that had no time for the tragedies of the wealthy. Judge Judy looked down at her desk, organizing her pens, then glanced up one last time at the defendant. "Miss Sterling," she said, her voice dropping into that familiar, resonant tone that commanded silence. "You came in here thinking that your status made you untouchable. You thought that if you were loud enough, rich enough, or connected enough, the rules didn't apply to you. But in this room, there is only the law, and there is only the truth. You learned a very expensive lesson today. I hope, for your sake, it's one that sticks." As Chloe walked toward the exit, the confident, smirk-wearing girl was gone. In her place was someone who finally understood the weight of consequence. She pushed open the courtroom doors and stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the city rushing to meet her. But the air felt different now. The world hadn't changed, but she had. She finally understood that power was never meant to be a shield, and that when the room goes quiet and the status fades, character is the only currency that actually matters. The trial was over, but the reflection had only just begun.